The Honourable Nanaia Mahuta.
Mr Speaker, that member challenged us to be plain speaking. Well, you couldn't get more plain speaking than this. This bill is just a meagre attempt to cost cut with no reason or demonstration of benefits to the public, cut public services, cut public sector jobs and cut the role of community and voluntary sector, non-government organisations out of the equation. So it's that simple, Mr Speaker. I want to confine my contribution on this debate to the aspects relating to the Charities Commission, because what the bill proposes to do is absorb the Charities Commission into the Department of Internal Affairs. Now, I'm a great believer that form follows function. And the question must be asked to members on the other side of the House is, why are they absorbing the Charities Commission into the Department of Internal Affairs when the non-government sector themselves have raised concerns about that, when they've asked the government to implement the review that was promised under the 2005 Charities Act when the Charities Commission was set up, and when they've asked to be consulted on this particular issue? Because yes, while there are concerns in the non-government organisations about the way in which the Charities Commission is undertaking their role, there is time for the review to be implemented, to get feedback from the sector and work with the sector, just as Labor did when we initiated the Charities Commission, to ensure that the progress of legislation and the form and role of the Charities Commission can work alongside the very important role of the community and voluntary sector and non-government organisations. I urge the Māori Party member who spoke before me to read the letter from ANGOA, the Association of Non-Government Organisations of Aotearoa, that was sent to Tariana Turia, urging her to pause on this particular issue, because they have very real concerns about the lack of autonomy and independence that may eventuate from absorbing the Charities Commission into the Department of Internal Affairs. Now, Labor believes that there is a very strong role that the Charities Commission can play in the long term. In fact, the education role that they currently play to upskill volunteers, to strengthen the governance and financial management role in our voluntary organisations is a good one. We are concerned that the government has made no commitment whatsoever in this area to continue this role, and we're very sceptical, in fact, that by absorbing the Charities Commission into the Department of Internal Affairs, that arm's length independence will be lost. Now, this isn't because it's a nice... We don't believe that the independent role of the Charities Commission should be done because it's a nice thing to do. No, because by virtue of the work undertaken by the charitable sector, by the community and voluntary sector, by non-government organisations in terms of the advocacy that it undertakes, which sometimes criticises government policy, should be at arm's length and should remain autonomous and independent. That's why. Mr Speaker, I don't think that the views of the sector have been listened to very well at all by the government, and they are certainly listening to this debate and questioning what the go-forward opportunity is with this government. The issue of kia tūtahi and how that as a working document for the community and voluntary sector is supposed to partner with the community sector is not upheld by what is being achieved here today. Mr Speaker, I also wanted to point out that insofar as feedback from community organisations on this matter, it is worth mentioning that they have advocated to a number of ministers over this year about ways in which constructive opportunities to review the role of the Commission and the way it can better function going forward has been offered time after time after time. But has the government listened? No. In this instance, it's introducing a measure that is not supported by the sector, that does not demonstrate the gains back to the community and voluntary sector, but most importantly, that fails to recognise that a whole review, a comprehensive review of the Charities Act could in fact have been reached if they accelerated the review date that is already set down in the Charities Act legislation. Mr Speaker, while it would be too easy to skim over this particular part of the bill, I think we owe it to our community organisations, the 25,000 that have already been registered, to provide some type of reason as to why the government is taking the steps that it has today to absorb the Charities Commission into the Department of Internal Affairs. Nobody can really understand the reasons. And that's the least that could be done to those 25,000 organisations throughout the country. Now, they play an important role, and especially in tough times when families are struggling. And every member in this House knows that who picks up the slack? Our community organisations, the community and voluntary sector, our non-government organisations. In fact, what they will be telling a number of members in this House, and certainly the members in the Labour team, is they are picking up far more slack with less pūtea than ever before. And so while the government is washing its hands of any responsibility to fund the capacity of the community and voluntary sector, NGOs to do their job well, to be able to respond to the vulnerable needs of families out there, what is the government doing? Hiding all of its commitments by making this meagre change not supported by the sector, and may continue to erode the very important role that they are actually taking up in our communities. Mr. Speaker, without prolonging my contribution, I can quite confidently say that a number of organisations in the community and voluntary sector will be making submissions on this part of the bill. I look forward to that. We won't be supporting it because we don't believe that cost-cutting measures which aim to cut public services, cut jobs in the public sector are indeed going to happen, are indeed going to deliver the benefits that the government thinks it will. Mr. Speaker, one last thing. Here's a little example of an organisation that was deregistered that is making a particular contribution in the area of social housing. Now, Labour were particularly concerned that Minister Phil Heatley refused last year to intervene to restore the charitable status to Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust. Now, they play a very important role in the area of social housing and providing for community housing. At a time when the Minister could have shown leadership about the important role that organisations like that have in our communities to put a high urgency and obligation on community housing, emergency housing, social housing in our communities to respond to those very important needs, the government did nothing. The Minister did nothing, and he could have intervened and turn that situation around. And we cannot see, Mr. Speaker, situations where the government or the Minister fails to take leadership on important obligations and roles that are being undertaken by the charitable sector. This is just not good enough, and we won't tolerate it. So I believe it has enormous implications going forward for other organisations who are undertaking these types of charitable obligations, and we don't want to see that trend continue. I hope that becomes a subject of the submissions that are raised in the Select Committee, and especially invite those organisations that have been deregistered to present their views to the Select Committee so that they can be heard in full. Mr. Speaker, having outlined quite specifically the nature of our concerns, I'm pleased to say that Labour will not support this bill. We don't believe that will deliver any benefits. And Mr. Speaker, insofar as the community and the voluntary sector go, I back them, the government doesn't. Labour backs them, but the government doesn't.
Members, again in accordance with the determination of the Business Committee, I call on Lynn Pillay to make her valedictory statement.